and its role in global affairs. We'll hear from an author who believes the U.S. relationship with Pakistan could worsen if America does not shift to a strategy of engagement and containment. This is 2 Hours.
Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Cohen of the Foreign Policy Studies program at Brookings, and I'd like to welcome you this afternoon to Brookings for the launch, or the American launch, of The Future of Pakistan. There will be an Indian and a Pakistani edition. I don't know if there'll be launches there, but we want to have this the formal launch. The book had its origins about a year and a half ago. Is this okay? Is this better? The book had its origins. It's the outcome of a project that had its origins shortly after I finished the book called The Idea of Pakistan in 2004. It was clear that under General Pervez Musharraf, under Pervez Musharraf's leadership, that Pakistan was not dealing effectively with a number of economic, political, and governance problems. One of the many paradoxes of Pakistan is that there are more than enough competent Pakistanis to operate a really effective, impressive country. I did not think Musharraf's leadership was effective, or that he could overcome the institutional barriers that block good governance. There were also strained relations with India and the United States. Nevertheless, Pakistan is important for many reasons. Its size, its resources, its professedly Islamic identity, its quarrels with several of its neighbors, including Afghanistan and India, its nuclear program, and its status as both a sponsor and as a victim of terrorism. The project that led to this book was an attempt to look ahead 5 to 7 years beyond the immediate crisis. I've written that Pakistan is marinated in crisis. From the time I've been studying Pakistan in 1977, it's been one crisis after another. We wanted to take a medium-range view of Pakistan, so we assembled a diverse and expert group. There were Pakistanis, Americans, Europeans, and Indians. Some were former government officials or retired ambassadors, 3 retired ambassadors, in fact. Some were academics, and there were some young scholars as well. To each, I posed 2 questions. How did they see Pakistan in 5 to 7 years from that date, which was a year and a half ago? And in their judgment, what were the key factors that might shape Pakistan's future? So really, it's 2 simple questions drove the book. Their answers to these questions are in the book. We want to thank the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations, the Norwegian Peacebuilding Foundation, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and several individuals for their support. The individuals include Azima Chima, Aram Haider, and Tino Xavier, my present research assistant. Ellen Hughes was the editor of the Brookings Press, and above all, I want to thank the contributors to this book. Today, we're fortunate to have several of the contributors with us, and also several people who have recently written their own books on Pakistan, including Pamela Constable, John Schmidt, and Teresita Schaefer. They've all recently published excellent books on Pakistan. There are others we could have invited, but we simply didn't have the time or the resources to do that. Given this rich assortment of talent, we decided to make this a longer than usual book launch, with 2 panels instead of 1. So if you've paid your money to get in here, you get 2 for the price of 1. Or 2 cups of coffee for the price of 1. I've asked the panel chairs, Ambassador Teresita Schaefer, and a Brookings non-resident fellow, and John Schmidt, the author, John Schmidt, to ask the panelists to briefly state how recent events might change their judgment about the futures of Pakistan. In other words, give them an opportunity now to assess what they wrote a year ago, or a year and a half ago in some cases, about the future of Pakistan. Before we go to the first panel, let me ask one of the contributors, Ambassador William Milam, to say a few words in memory of one of the project's participants, Sir Hilary Sennott, who was a source of wisdom and insight. Bill?
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, Hillary was a dear friend of mine from the time we served together in Pakistan before 9/11, actually, in those years, which we now look back on as maybe halcyon years of our relationship. They weren't that great then, however. If I think of Hillary, sorry, is that better? When I think of Hillary, I think of several words: stoicism, rectitude, pragmatism, insight, and candor. He was a very private person until you got to know him, and then he was a very warm person. And he was very multi-talented. He started life as a naval engineer and served in submarines, and then decided to surface, I guess, in the diplomatic corps. And after serving in Europe, became one of the Foreign Office's leading officials and experts on South Asia. He found his home, I think, in the diplomatic corps, served in India, Pakistan, and was head of the FCO office that heads South Asia. His last position, however, I think was one that took him way out of his line of endeavor, and in fact was was probably the worst time of his professional life. He was for 6 months the head of the British administration in Basra, starting in summer of 2003, after the Iraq military part of the Iraq conflict had wound down. He wrote about this last period in a book called Bad Days in Basra, and I don't think I need to tell you what the book that the book was not a very good appreciation of either our effort or the British effort in Iraq. And for a year or so afterwards, he remained rather, I should say, bitter about the experience. He also, however, wrote 2 books about South Asia, one about the advent of nuclearization of both Pakistan and India. And his last book, I think, was The Transformation of Pakistan, which is a very optimistic book about what could be the future of Pakistan, I think. But he didn't dodge trying to tell the truth about Pakistan's deficits. He, I think, and Steve has written this in the foreword to the book that we're launching, but I thought he showed his insights, among other things, by using a term I hadn't heard before. He said that, well, many people think that when you're viewing Pakistan, you either come from a glass half full or a glass half empty. He said, in fact, I think it's a glass too large. And that was, of course, to try and propound the idea that that Pakistan may have set out in life with more ambition than it had resources to fulfill. I want to talk a little bit. Our final communications. I saw Hillary a lot in the last few years. Last June, only a few months ago, when I arrived in England, I sent him an email saying I'm here. And for the first time, I got an email back saying, gee, I'm sorry, I can't meet with you, but I hope your visit goes very well, et cetera, et cetera. We had 2 or 3 more exchanges of emails, and he was always very cheerful, very chipper, very upbeat. I told him I was writing a paper on public opinion in Pakistan. He said he'd love to see it, and just as soon as he got out of the hospital, and he literally was on his deathbed when he wrote those things. And by the way, I think his last writing for publication was about a 5-paragraph thing in Foreign Policy on, and I think the title was, yes, be angry with Pakistan's treachery, but don't go nuts. Anyway, this is perhaps a bit too long, but it's my memorial to a very dear friend, who I would say, in Shakespeare's words, reflected the constant service of the antique world, where people serve for duty. And he was not, I think, in a sense, for the fashion of our times. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I could add that it was Sir Hillary who warned me off the idea that we were a Delphi panel. which was the original concept of the group that met, he pointed out that the Oracle of Delphi was a woman, and her predictions, when accepted, often led to the person to disaster. So we scrapped the notion of a Delphi panel. Let me now turn the panel over to Ambassador Teresita Schaefer, whose own book, recent book with her husband, is probably one of the 5 best books on Pakistan, how Pakistan negotiates with the United States. And we have about an hour for the panel presentation discussion. Then we'll bring the second panel up here and then conclude the meeting no later than 4. Thank you. Teresita.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this. I still remember with some regret your having initially invited me to participate in the book project, which I wasn't able to do, so I'm getting dessert without having had the main course. And thank you, Bill, for those lovely remarks about Sir Hilary Sinnott, who certainly, in my recollection as well, was a decent and thoughtful and creative public servant of a sort one doesn't see that many of. It is my pleasant duty to introduce my fellow panelists. Before I do so, I wanted to give you kind of a thought to frame the discussion. I've encouraged each of the panelists to focus on some of the things that their particular chapters in the book brought in, which were unique to them or are under-discussed issues, so I very much hope that that is what you will get. If I were going to be a panelist, which I'm not, I would have focused on Pakistan-U.S. relations, which are, of course, going through a particularly awful time right at the moment. The central thesis of of the book, which I wrote with my husband, is that Pakistan's prime negotiating tactic with the United States is what one might call the art of the guilt trip. One of my more eloquent Pakistani friends referred to it as playing the victimization card. This doesn't necessarily mean that the guilt trip is inappropriate or the victimization card misplaced, but it is a way of dealing with a relationship which frankly has been very difficult for both sides and which is at a high point of difficulty for both sides now. I assume that this will form part of the backdrop of some of the presentations you're talking about, although this is not in the first instance a book about U.S.-Pakistan relations. So let me introduce the panelists, and I will introduce each of them as he or she comes up. And the first one, to my immediate left, is Dr. Christine Fair, Assistant Professor in the Center for Peace and Security Studies at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, who has a distinguished career in political science, data analysis, an embarrassingly to the rest of us long list of distinguished books. But the one I don't see on this otherwise splendid bio is The Cuisines of the Axis of Evil. And I think that your understanding of Chris Fair will be incomplete unless you delve into that as well. Christine, you can talk about cuisine or something else. The floor is yours for the next 5 minutes.
Actually, Pakistan is in the, oh, Mike, yeah. Actually, Pakistan is in the book. There's, you know, it was the funnest book ever. I got paid something like $13,000, $15,000 to write the thing before it was written. It was fabulous. But Pakistan, along with Israel and India, they're all included in the book as a part of the NPT plus 3 states. So the Pakistan chapter is called A Dinner in Hayattabad, A Night with the Taliban. Anyways, it's a real cookbook. I actually cut my finger off working on the Iraq chapter. Don't drink and blend is my advice to all of you. All right, so when Steve asked me to come on board, the time, I think it was difficult in 2009 to be terribly optimistic about Pakistan and its foundational challenges, which was my charge. And in the wake of the recent year's events, it's even more difficult to be even less pessimistic than I was. So in the chapter that I wrote for Steve, I laid out what I think are a number of foundational challenges. There's this tendency in Washington, and quite frankly elsewhere, to look at the Pakistani problem set of the day. So for example, there's the FATA problem, there's the democracy problem, there's the army problem, there's the terrorism problem. But when I look at the Pakistan problem set, in my view, it largely reduces to what I think is the fundamental failure of constitutionalism. Whether we're looking at FATA, what is FATA? FATA is a failure of constitutionalism. Looking at civil-military relations, it's another example of failure of constitutionalism. And so that was the optic that I had for the chapter. And the specific issues that I discuss, I think there are a few that I'd like to adumbrate upon today. The first is the source of terrorism. Now, I don't want to rehash what we all know. I mean, anyone who's been watching the news should have a fairly big clue that Pakistan uses its nuclear umbrella with impunity such that it can use jihad as its primary instruments of coercion. We all kind of get this. Many of us have also understood that many of Pakistan's erstwhile proxies have turned against the state. Now, when I've looked at the literature of these militant groups, I'd like to draw your attention to perhaps a trend that's less obvious to some of you. You all have been perhaps noticing the Sufi shrines that have been increasingly under attack. Well, this is really quite new in the history of Pakistan. And when we talk about sectarian violence, and I'm going to include now this violence on Brahmins, also known as Sufis, we're really talking about one perpetrator, and that is a group of Deobandi militants. They're a network of groups, they overlap. But I think one of the most singularly disturbing trends in Pakistan is the ability of these Deobandi groups, who numerically, quite frankly, as far as we know, remain a minority, to declare who is or is not munafiqeen, someone who causes dissent in the ummah, and then to persecute them and prosecute deadly violence. This is absolutely new. Pakistan has seen killing of Ahmadiyas. Pakistan has seen the slaughtering of Shia, senseless though it may be. But the idea that a minority Muslim or a sectarian tradition in Pakistan is arrogated to its right, arrogated to itself the right to say who or is not a Muslim is really something that's quite new. One of the things that has very much depressed me as someone who's had a long-standing relationship with Pakistan is that there is no ownership of this problem and how it arose. If there can be no ownership, there can be no solution. Everyone talks about the silent majority. You know what? I don't think there's a silent majority. I think for those of us that were in Pakistan during the Taseer killing, people that we had known for decades justify the killing of Salman Taseer for being a blasphemer. There were things I heard people say that I'd known for so long that I never want to hear those folks say again. So for those of us that have been in Pakistan during these times of crises, it's really shocking what you think the silent majority would say, but I suspect if the silent majority were to open up their mouths, you'd ask them to shut up. Similarly, I was in Lahore teaching last summer when Dr. Gunjbakhsh was attacked. Very clearly, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, one of these Deobandi affiliates. I went to the old town, the old city where I'd been a student, talked to some folks I'd known for decades. In their assessment, it was the Indians that did it. So you have these proxies gone wild that's literally tearing the fabric of the state apart. And the tendency is not to diagnose the problem, which is the deep state's reliance upon Islamist militants under its expanding nuclear umbrella, but rather to externalize this problem anywhere and everywhere it can. Even of late, following the recent debacle in U.S.-Pakistan relations, you'll find people saying, what's wrong with our jihad when you have imperialism? Now, whether or not we have imperialism is an issue that we can debate, perhaps over a lubricating beverage, but the very fact that it's not an embarrassment to say that we have a jihad strategy, but rather this is a counterpoint or a counter strategy to imperialism. And I think you see this in the platform that Imran Khan brings to the table. Imran Khan is both exciting because he is innovating the Pakistani polity, particularly the youth. But the way in which he's doing so, I think, is not terribly a cause for civil society activists to be hopping up and down with glee, right? He is taking Pakistan to a very bizarre notion of Islam. He had his period as a rakish gentleman, sowing his seeds throughout the West, and now, of course, he's excluding the West as he turns to embrace Islam. And he's doing this as a way of recuperating Pakistan's sovereignty. In the course of doing this, of course, he's got the blessings of GHQ, so we should not be mistaken that this, ex-Lothario cricket player is going to be anything other than business as usual. He's very soft on the Pakistan Taliban. He's very soft on the Afghan Taliban. And by soft, I mean doesn't really think that they're a problem. So, if you kind of look at how Pakistan is dealing with both Islamist violence on the one hand and there's really no way of getting at this. Then you also have to look at the debates that are taking place within Pakistan about who the state is for. And in this sense, I think Farzana Sheikh has perhaps written the best book about these fault lines of the state and the nation. Who is Pakistan for? What role are there for, obviously Ahmadiyya's got kicked out pretty quickly. What role is there for Shia in the state? Obviously, non-Muslim minorities, but as I said, increasingly these Barelvis as well are coming under the gun from Deobandi militants. So at the end of the day, when I look at this, what I really see, and I could go on these various points, we have fundamental issues that Pakistan can't resolve. And in a functioning state, we would have political parties that would be the mediator of resolving fundamental issues about constitutionalism, who is the state for, what's the relationship between the center and the provinces. But as you know, in Pakistan, these, and I don't care whether they're religious, oddly enough, the most democratic party is the Jamaat Islami, a religious party, they're all, to one degree or another, vertically integrated personality cults, right? They don't aggregate national interest. And so when you look at Pakistan's fundamental challenges and you try to line up, well, here's what it would take to resolve some of these issues, the elements of statesmanship and electoral politics, which is of course driven on patronage, don't really seem to be in alignment to address these fundamental challenges. And so where I conclude the chapter with Steve is actually where I concluded a piece in 2009, and there's a luminary that's picked up on this, Bruce Riedel, and that is containment. I think that the last 10 years of trying to assuage Pakistan to behave differently with allurements, mostly financial allurements and weapon systems, should have just abused us, that these are adequate to change Pakistan's strategic calculus and the way it makes its decision in terms of its actions in the region. So in the last several talks I've given, I've put forth what I think is a model that we can debate. It's not a perfect model, but it's the Soviet Union. Right? During the period of the Soviet Union, we had no illusions of friendship, right? We were adversaries. We wanted different things for the region. Our goals were completely orthogonal. And we operated against one another more than we operated with each other, right? But we didn't cut off military relations. We didn't cut off diplomatic relations. We stayed there, but we understood the goal. We understood the problem set. We invested in civil society, not with this notion of necessarily being transformative, but one day when this system breaks open, there'll be people to work with. And then the final point that I'd like to leave for your consideration, and this is where I get myself most into trouble in talking about this, is that we learned that the Soviet Union could fail, right? That the nuclear problem would be handled, that the world was not going to end. And going to Ambassador Schaefer's remarks, ultimately, Pakistan is able to drive the system of international relations because of its fear that it will fail. And so I think we actually have a lot to learn from the Cold War about how we might manage our future relationship with Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Our next speaker will be Ambassador Bill Milam, a senior policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, and once ambassador in Bangladesh, where he was the successor by a few to my husband, and subsequently, excuse me, in Pakistan. Before any of that, however, we were colleagues in the U.S. Foreign Service, where Bill was the shining light among economic officers. And I'm hoping he will let some of that light shine through his presentation this afternoon. Bill.
Well, the light may go out halfway through this, but let's see. Anyway, I do plan to devote most of my remarks, or at least the last part of my remarks, to the economy. But because I did, evidently I was one who covered that in the book in a very, very superficial and not very helpful way, but and I think maybe that does bear looking into, because when in all of the talk that we've had, a lot of talk we have about Pakistan, one rarely hears mention of the economy, which is a shambles. But let me just say first that these papers were written first a couple of years ago, revised for the Brookings website, and then revised again about 6 to 8 months ago for the book. So they're you know, revisions of the revision. But you know something, I think it shows how fast things are moving with Pakistan in almost all ways, that we want to stand up here, at least I want to stand up here and tell you what I would have done differently had I been writing it today. And I'll go very briefly through those. The first is, in an early part of my chapter, I write something that I thought was quite illuminating at the time, that there was certainly going to be a political solution in Afghanistan. Well, anybody who reads that now thinks, where's this guy been? The second thing is, I write an article called, a section called The Lost Generation, which I thought was not too bad, and it did catch the exclusionist elements that Chris talked about. But had I been writing it now, I would have translated those into the enormous volatility and the power of public opinion in Pakistan, which drives everything, including probably, I'm sure, the latest downturn in our relationship. So, and I would have also written in the part on U.S.-Pakistan relations that were I writing it now, I would have played down to almost zero, if you will, the importance of our economic assistance, the Kerry Lugar-Berman bill. It was a great idea, but I think it's not the solution, and never was, to the relationship. We need bigger ideas, I think, or different ideas, maybe not bigger. Now, in regards to the economy, one of the reasons one doesn't hear about it much these days is because, for some reason, hard to know why exactly, things evidently seem pretty good in Pakistan. People are not complaining. They seem to they're working hard to fix their energy problem, to fix their monetary problem, but in fact, I think most economists who are familiar with Pakistan would tell you that Pakistan is driving over an economic cliff, and who knows when the edge of that cliff will be reached. But things are not likely to be able to stay as they are very much longer. They have, as you well know, because it's been old news now for several months, decided that they'll have no more truck with the International Monetary Fund, which means that, in fact, they begin paying back the fund next month, I think, and of that great amount of what they call reserves, which comes in the foreign exchange reserves, most of it belongs to the fund, and that doesn't belong to the fund belongs to other lenders such as China. So there will come a time in the near future, unless things change somehow, where they will be down to a very few months' imports, and they will begin to panic, and the exchange rate will begin to deteriorate even worse than it is. You know, in that sense, and they are heading for shortages on imports, shortages of things like energy imports, or actually pulling in their horns and going back to the IMF. But what would the IMF mean? The IMF would mean that they would have to agree to some very, very difficult conditions, difficult economically and probably more difficult politically. They'd have to agree to pay much more in taxation. Their GDP ratio is now like about 8%. That makes ours look good. In fact, they have no intentions of, although they claim they do, their plans to raise taxes are raise the revenue base do not look very feasible, given the political situation. So then They've also adopted a monetary policy which, in the teeth of inflation, doesn't make much sense at all, because they seem to be, as far as I can tell, increasing the money supply, which is so sooner or later you will get to some sort of spiraling inflation, driving food prices up as well as the prices of everything else, as well as again having a spillback effect on their foreign exchange rates. So I don't think I'll go into exquisite detail on this, but I think the next big crunch in Pakistan, certainly coming soon. Well, I've got a whole minute left. How about that? But I don't need a whole minute. The next big crunch in Pakistan will be on the economy, and how it comes out. I am not sanguine unless they put their tail between their legs, their hands together, not in the begging bowl, but in this position, and go to the international agencies, the IMF, the World Bank, and plead and promise, really, for that they will make structural changes in return for a little help. We'll see if that happens, but I wouldn't bet on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And our next speaker is Shuja Nawaz, who was born in Pakistan and has been, since January 2009, the first director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council, having had an eclectic and distinguished career before that with various think tanks, stints at the IMF, the World Health Organization, and at various publications. And he's probably best known in this town for his book, Cross Swords, Pakistan, Its Army, and the Wars Within, which is a history of Pakistan told largely but not entirely through the prism of the Pakistan Army, of whose importance in Pakistan's daily life we are given daily reminders.